Okay, so this was a photo I took this is a photo taken of myself in 2010. It was taken in Scotland, and what I'm doing is I'm photographing a beach in the Outer Hebrides called Triac Moor. As you can see, I'm pretty rugged up. It's almost winter. Wearing my waterproofs, tops and bottoms, and some wellies. I'm carrying a heavy backpack full of camera equipment, filters. If only I was always so well prepared. But I think the photo gives a sense that it is a solo exercise, and for me, most of the time, it is. If you'd shown me this photo in 2005, before I knew how to use a camera, I would have been absolutely incredulous what I was doing there on this remote beach in Scotland. So what I was doing was actually taking this photo. I've given all my photos names so that I don't have to call them IMG 906. So I've called this one Shapeshifter. First of all, I like the S in it because the basis of the composition is S-shaped sort of leading line. And also, it took me a while to find this composition. I'd been walking around the beach for about half an hour. The light was getting good, and finally I came up with this composition, and I liked the composition. I knew I was going to come back the day after, so I actually downloaded the image onto my iPhone in case I couldn't find it the next day. Problem was that the patterns had completely changed the next day, so I needed to work from scratch again, and that is one of the exciting things about photographing seascapes, this constant change. Unlike lots of other landscapes, this change occurs every second, hours, weeks, years. Each wave is different. This is another photo taken in Scotland. Here is the famous Elgol Beach. It's also in the Hebrides, but this time on the Isle of Skye. It's a bit of a mecca for photographers around the world since English photographer Joe Cornish made it famous. One of the first books on landscape photography I bought was a book called First Light. It doesn't mean like first light at dawn, it means first light. And that has a photo of Elgol on its cover. There's a boulder in his photo, which is in a key composition, which is in the key position of the composition, catching a golden glow, which is now known colloquially as the Cornish boulder. Anyway, these distinctive coastal locations like this are what I travel around the world for, what I search for, and what makes this a great photography location? Well, if you look at the foreground, you've got basically an unlimited scope for creating an original foreground. Pebbles and rocks are multicoloured, although it's not particularly well conveyed in this particular photo. And the backdrop of the Kulin Mountains makes it immediately recognisable. And I really love this combination of coasts and mountains. It's not all that common, but I can think of a few places in New Zealand where you can find this sort of arrangement. This sort of light is my favourite light to photograph. It's a soft glow well after sunset, known as afterglow, and it's just hitting the foreground, giving it some warmth. I think too many photographers leave very soon after the sun sets and misses out on this sort of light. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. This is the only non-coastal scene that I'll be showing you today. My roots as a photographer started here. It was while I was working as a locum doctor in Tasmania, and I drove around the island state, and this mountain, Cradle Mountain, was one of the main tourist attractions. There's not a lot of tourist attractions that aren't sort of wilderness in Tasmania, and it's Australia's most photographed mountain and marks the beginning of the overland track, considered the country's best multi-day hike, which I would eventually get to tramp the next year. In any case, the feeling of awe and being part of something greater was a spiritual experience, and it inspired me to become a photographer. So now I'm a photographer based in Melbourne, and I shoot actually a wide variety of subjects, mainly travel related, but I'm always drawn back to the wild places of our planet. So while I was in Tasmania, I started to turn my attention towards the seascapes, and they became a particular favourite of mine to photograph. At that time, around 2005, there weren't a lot of people that specialised in seascape. That's very much changed today, and the genre has become very, very popular, and it's difficult to distinguish yourself from the tons of coastal landscapes that are popping up today. So I began to research beaches with unique geology, and there were some coastal national parks in Tasmania. And some of the most interesting were to be found in Tasman National Park, including this, which is called the natural, or the tessellated pavement. It looks like it's man-made, but it's all natural. These are the picnic rocks, also in Tasmania, and they're found in Mount William National Park. And they're part of a stretch along the east coast known as the Bay of Fires, and the name comes from the combination of white sands, blue water, and orange lichen-encrusted boulders. Of particular note here are the anti-crepuscular rays here at sunset. Now, often what you see is as the sun's setting or sun's on the horizon, you can see rays passing through the clouds. But these are actually happening on the opposite side of where the sun is. I've only witnessed it once. So at this point, these Tasmanian photos already showed that I had a penchant for wide-angle compositions, usually in a landscape orientation such as this. Just also, by the way, with this presentation, I've tried to use as many landscape-orientated photos as possible, just that they look better than sort of squished up. Now, since I started photographing Tasmanian landscapes, local photographers were my source of inspiration, and among them was Peter Dombrovskis, whom I still consider along my top landscape photographers of all time. Interestingly, I've already mentioned Joe Cornish and that connection with Elgol Beach and his book First Light. Interestingly, Joe also holds Dombrovskis in very high regard, and he paid homage by visiting Tasmania and talking to Peter's widow. In fact, there's a couple of Tasmanian landscapes in that book. And then, of course, another inspiration was the great Galen Rowell, who's probably the most influential on landscape photographers of today. And he's credited with coining the term the magic hour, which is, part of my website name. Here is a photo that I've called Taming the Storm. It's actually photographed during a storm, very tumultuous looking sea, but with a 5-minute exposure, I feel that I've tamed the storm in that you've got the clouds looking soft, and over 5 minutes I've turned the churning sea into flat, glassy looking water. So I'm just going to show you a few scenes where I've used shutter speed to create effects, mood, and drama. So that's quite a long exposure of 5 minutes. This is from my home state of Victoria. This is another obscure location that's become famous mainly because of its photographic potential. It's on Phillip Island, and this one is 77 seconds, this exposure. What's different about this is that the whole foreground looks kind of misty, and you get that effect when the water is not fully covering the rocks throughout the time of the exposure. So you get if you get a few waves to wash over the rocks, you'll get that misty swirling effect. Otherwise, if the water's covering everything completely, then you get that glassy look that you see in the midground there. This is Cape Rattle, this is also in Tasmania, and these are the tallest sea cliffs in Australia in this national park, and they're very impressive examples of columnar dolerite. I hear they're quite. I hear this area is world famous because I had a climber ask me when he saw this photo and said, "Is this where the infamous totem pole is?" And yes, it is. This exposure is 30 seconds, so about half what the last one was, and you can see that there's a little bit of texture in the water, just around there. Okay, so going back to the mainland, here is Croajingolong, which is a rugged coastal national park near the border of New South Wales and Victoria. Here I've used a shutter speed of 0.8 seconds, and it results in visible waves, but with a softened look. And the golden light at dawn hitting the yellow rocks really makes it quite an intense glow. Okay, I've got two photos of Curio Bay, which is found in the far south in the Catlins. It's special for its geology. The rock platforms there is actually petrified forest, so you can see tree stumps there. You also get these yellow-eyed penguins. Now, I witnessed this fiery sunrise in 2010, took this photo, and a year later returned and almost had exactly the same sort of sunrise, maybe a bit better. It's interesting to see the two differences. The composition's almost the same. Here I've kept the shutter open for 2.5 seconds, so you can see there's a bit of a misted appearance. There's a wave going across there that you can't really delineate very much. And then this is the one I took last year, so a year after. I've used a shutter speed of 0.3 seconds, so much faster shutter speed. And here you've got a wave almost in exactly the same spot. You can see it clearly, and you can really see the splash. And there's a much more. I think it's a stronger photo, much more dynamic, and it actually ended up winning the landscape section in the digital camera competition, which is quite a good competition. It's not very prestigious, but it does have good cash prizes, and it's always. And what's better, they pay in pounds. It's always good to be paid in pounds. So after taking that photo, I happened to have my long lens with me, luckily, and so immediately after taking that one, I took it out and got this photo of these fellows, and this one actually won first prize in the threatened species section of last year's Anzac competition, which is the main nature photography competition in Australia. So I'll just go through what I consider the important elements of a photograph. Light, obviously. I've put light second there, but for a long time I considered light to be the most important factor in a photograph. After all, that's what it means, doesn't it? Writing with light. However, with time, I realised there's a world of difference between merely recording or documenting great light and making a compelling photo. So at the moment, I'm thinking that composition is by far the most important element of a photograph. It's the artist's opportunity to stamp his or her style and personality and to show the viewers something that they wouldn't necessarily see if they had witnessed the event themselves. And a great composition is what keeps me looking after the initial wow of the light show has abated. Subject, choosing your locations, I think, is important. I do some street photography as well, and many of the masters made their names shooting cities like Paris and New York, and I don't think that's an accident. Seascapes are the most accessible landscapes to photographers and viewers. I don't think it doesn't take a lot to produce a nice image. Photos of pretty sunsets, waves cascading, rocks are quite common. On the other hand, it makes it very difficult to create something that really stands out. So I do try to find locations that are distinctive in some way. Technique. Just as you need to be proficient with language to communicate, technique is required to properly express vision. And there's a whole lot of aspects of technique, from what you do in your camera using filters to the whole post-processing stage. Each year, Veolia, Wildlife Photographer of the Year, gets about 40,000 entries, and speaking with the judges, this gets quickly whittled down to the final 1,000 who are the finalists. And many of the entries just get immediately wiped out due to poor technique or processing. So from these 1,000 finalists, 100 are chosen, around 100 are chosen for the final exhibit. So they're all the commended and prize-winning photos. And what does it take to, you've got composition, use of light, technique, subject, but I think to really get a judge's attention, you need that X factor, which is difficult to describe, but you usually know when you see it. It's like when you flick through a book of photos and suddenly you stop, you see one. I think this is what sets apart a good photo from one that has a chance at an award at Wapiti. Creativity, imagination, serendipity, they all come to play. Or just maybe something about the image that evokes a response from the viewer, makes them feel something. I try to imagine that there are 10 photographers with me and think about how my photograph is going to be different, how it's going to be me. If you look at, like in this year's exhibit, if you look at Bensei Mata's pelican photo, I'll bet if you put 100 photographers into that same situation, none of them would have that shot. You've never seen a photograph of a pelican with its mouth like that. So, he's shown people something that they've never seen before. So this is in my backyard, Victoria, the Great Ocean Road, which has some pretty impressive rock formations. We seem to be losing them quite quickly. The problem with the Great Ocean Road is that access to good viewpoints are few and compositions are limited. But if you have a bit of luck, like I did the time I photographed this, called the Island Arch at Lockhart Gorge, you can come away with something memorable. It's more memorable by the fact, for the fact that this arch collapsed soon afterwards. So that was it. This is another one that's collapsed. This is the London Bridge. As you can see, it's collapsed in the middle. It left some people stranded at the end. Fortunately, no one was hurt. So once again, composition's pretty limited, and I used the Milky Way above it to try to create something more original. And the most famous of all the Great Ocean Road locations, the 12 Apostles, really there's only a half dozen left. Seems that every few years another one succumbs. This was an example of using a unique lighting situation to try to produce something different. So what you have here is a simultaneous moon set and sunrise. So you have front and back lighting, which is quite unusual. So this is Gillespies Beach. So once again, the 12 Apostles. I wanted to try something different. So now what you see in virtually all the photos that I'm showing today is that they're all done in one exposure. I generally don't use multiple exposure. In fact, you're not allowed to use multiple exposure in Veolia. They've got the strictest rules in that you're very limited. You can't remove, you can't clone out stuff, you can't blend. Everything has to be in the one frame. Although this year they allowed you to stitch panoramas. So, but this photo is an exception. I've used two exposures, one to capture movement in the sky and one to preserve detail in the wave drawback. So a small twist to create something different. So what you're seeing in the sky is a 60-second exposure, and what you see in the foreground is a 2-second exposure. So this is Southern Swell. It was my first success in the Veolia competition. It was runners-up in the 2010 competition. And how did I hear about moeraki? Well, when I first started, when I was a beginner, I used to look at landscape photography books in the bookstores and bought quite a few of them. And the ones, the yearbooks always impressed me the most. I look at these photos and think, you know, this must be the pinnacle of nature photography, and reaching that sort of standard just seemed very far away, if not impossible at the time. It was actually sponsored by Shell in those days, so it was called the Shell Wildlife Photographer of the Year. And then some years later, I went on a photo tour of Namibia with one of my favourite wildlife photographers called Marcel van Oosten. And he had entered in many competitions and had been very successful. And a discussion with him confirmed that Veolia was indeed the most prestigious and the toughest to succeed in. At the time, he hadn't actually cracked it. Almost every year had been a finalist, but never made it to the exhibition. He finally broke through last year, and we had fun catching up in London at the opening events. I have very few wildlife and bird photos in my portfolio, but the ones that I have, I like very much, and they're mostly due to tips that I learned from Marcel from that workshop. So this image depicts morning storms at Hanson Bay, which is on Kangaroo Island in South Australia. This beach is very beautiful, but I don't think it's terribly distinctive. I think that perhaps the judges liked it because there was a sense of danger there. Certainly there's a lot of water flowing, but it was actually quite safe because all the water was flowing into the two gaps that you can see, and then you'd flow under the rocks back out. So once again, another photo of kangaroo. This is actually Kangaroo Island's most famous location, the remarkable rocks. And while I was in London for the Veolia opening events, I thought I'd sort of check out some of the surrounding coastline, and Cornwall was a very well-known, well-photographed location. This is Port Nanvan, which is virtually unknown except to photographers who come for its exceptional rock formations and boulders. This is also in Cornwall, Sandymouth Beach. So if you ask me which sort of photos I'd hang out on my own wall, this would probably be something that's soothing and soft. It was taken on a horrible day, very wet and very heavy cloud cover, just the usual Cornish white sky, but it just broke up for a few minutes, just letting some soft light in. And this was probably my highlight of the time I had in Cornwall, was the Bedruthen Steps, or Bedruthen Steps. These are really giant rock stacks which give it its name. It said that something to do with the giant Bedruthen. And another one from Cornwall, Land's End. I wrote an article on the blog for the Auckland Museum, and it was about how the camera doesn't always see how the eye does. This was photographed in almost total darkness, but the long exposure helped to bring out a lot of the subtle colours that the eyes just doesn't pick up. So it's as if on a long exposure the camera collects the light. And then on my travels, I went to France. One of the things I like to do each year is to go to Venice for the Carnival, and a lot of the masks that I photograph, 90% of them are French. And there was a French lady who said to me, "I've looked at your website and I think that you're going to like Brittany, you should come." And I thought, well, France and landscape, doesn't... France is known for its cultivated sort of landscapes, but wild, coastal, I was a bit sceptical, and she sent me a few photographs to show what she was talking about, and I thought, oh, okay, yep, that looks pretty good. So this year I went over to Brittany and spent quite a few weeks there, and I'm just going to show you a couple of photos from this location, which is an island called Belle-Île-en-Mer, and I did about 3 photo shoots there, just to show you the sort of variety that you can come back with over a very short period of time. So this is the first photograph I took there. It was springtime, beautiful conditions, very little wind, all very calm. Immediately after taking that photograph, I went down those cliffs and water was still calm, and I took this long exposure. It's got a completely different feel to it. It's a 3.5-minute exposure that catches these moving clouds. And then we had some bad weather move in. I remember that reading the Lonely Planet guide to this island, and it said that half of Brittany goes there for their holidays, so watch out if you haven't got a hotel book. Well, I couldn't find a hotel, so I slept in the car, and it was stormy, and I was just kept awake the whole night because the car was vibrating and shaking. So I call this photo Shake, Rattle and Roll. And it looked awful. I think there might have been a few other photographers that came around, because I was up at dawn to see what was happening. It looked horrible. A few cars rocked up, and then no one got out of the car, and they all disappeared. And as soon as they all disappeared, I said, okay, something's going to happen. That's guaranteed, and something did. Just a hole in the sky opened up, and I just rushed down to capture this amazing cloud formation at sunrise. Another one from the top of the cliff there. And here's another place in Brittany. Of all the photographs that you've seen here, this was actually the most technically challenging. I don't think it looks that technically challenging, but it was, because this sort of photo is actually impossible to take in one exposure. These little flowers, these flowers are really tiny, and to get them to look a decent size, you have to be a couple of inches away from it. So I had to take one where I focused on the flowers so they're sharp, and one where I focused on the cliffs and then blended them together. The same scene later that evening, an 8-minute exposure, and that's illuminated with moonlight. Interestingly, although all the flowers moving, the image is completely sharp. All the flowers look really sharp over the 8 minutes because the cameras recorded the average position of the flowers. And part of the same shoot, I took my telephoto out and got a few other scenes. Just some reflected light at sunset. And then the famous arch at Etretat, White Cliffs. Okay, so the moeraki boulders. I first landed on the South Island in 2008. I was on a trip commissioned by Canon to take 10 photos that they could use to show off their new camera. And one of the reasons why I decided to come to South Island was that some photographers I knew, Verena and Georg Popp, who are Austrian photographers, came, and I think they were some of the first international photographers to shoot the moeraki boulders. At that time, no one had heard of these moeraki boulders. So this 10-day trip wasn't very successful in terms of yield for me, but two things happened that were very important. The first were the couple of photos I made of the moeraki boulders on my final morning, and they made the whole trip worthwhile. So this is one of them, and it ended up winning a prize in a British award and also in the Art Wolf Invitation in USA. And there's also a vertical version, which I'll show you in a sec. The second important thing that happened is that I unearthed a huge photographic potential of a stretch of beach in Paparoa National Park that would become what I would regard as the best beach in the world for photography. So here's the vertical version of that. It's a different perspective, and I think it evokes a completely different feel, even though they're probably photographed minutes apart. One of the things that Marcel van Oosten used to say a lot on our workshop was that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. I always often think of that. It's also appeared on the Southern Exposure book that's just been recently released by New Zealand Geographic, which is a collection of photos from the Flickr group, which I recommend that you check out. On that first trip, I also came across this beach, Gillespies Beach, also on the west coast. Also has a lot of sandflies. But I really love that beach because I've returned a few times and it's always changed because all the driftwood that's been brought in changes every couple of days. And on my second trip, I went back to Gillespies Beach and photographed this. This is it's one of those beaches where you can go to and photograph and not even have the sea or any water there, because you've got the driftwood, cool pebbles, and the Alps behind there. This is a pretty long exposure, Swell, 30 seconds, picking up that afterglow that I was talking about, and another one with the afterglow. The camera really does see very different. People think that it's a trick that you've used some light painting. It's not. The eye's not used to seeing that way. Okay, now this is Tunnel Beach, which is near Dunedin. I found out about this beach from Joe Cornish's book, which depicted it in a moody long exposure. And I remember the experience behind this photo very well. It had been raining really heavily all day, and I dragged myself to the start of the trail even though a chute looked out of the question. And then a miracle, a hole in the sky, which widened, rainbows, and then the storm started to clear. I'm sitting on a rock as big as a house watching all this unfold. And then as the storm clears, the tide's going out, so that after sunset, I'm able to step onto that beach and take in a breathtaking view. Meanwhile, you've got waves thundering in, crashing against the cliffs on either side, and a very bright moon rises just as you get pink clouds when the sun sets, you can get pink clouds when the moon rises or sets as well. And here a 7-minute exposure has painted these pink clouds across the sky. Now, watching a sky break up like that seems impossible, but it actually happens a lot. I've seen it. And changing weather patterns really make for good photos, I think. Okay, so this stretch of beach that I found in 2008, Paparoa National Park. So Paparoa National Park is between Greymouth and Westport. And you've got Punakaiki about midway there. And the stretch of beach that I think is the best is sort of between 10 and 12 miles. Oops. So it's a pretty new national park, 1987, and it protects a unique limestone karst environment. Limestone is responsible for a lot of the impressive formations that you see. The mountains, caves, canyons, blowholes, and those bizarre pancake formations that given rise to the pancake rocks at Punakaiki. And there's a sort of tropical feel to it with the palms there. So this is the photo I took in 2008, and it was the first occasion where I realised how much tides played in seascapes. So at that time I wasn't all that experienced, but so I wandered over to this beach. I found what I thought was a great composition in midday. That's what you normally do. And when the light's not so great, you go and you scout out your locations, find a composition. So I found one, and I said I'll come back in at sunset. I came back, and half the beach was not accessible anymore. My composition was gone. I think my composition would have been somewhere up there. Okay, it's just completely inaccessible. But I remembered it, and I took this photo. These rocks have a name. They're called Motukiki rocks, the rock stacks there. And so I came back in 2 years later. And there are a couple of things I really like about this photo is that it's often the small details that can make a big impact. And you take that tiny bird out of it, and the whole impact of that photo is greatly diminished. The other thing I like is just the light catching the tops of the waves. And this happened to be the photo I took the evening before photographing dawn stars. If you're wondering why the dimensions of this are a little bit different from the other photos, is that it's actually a stitch of 2 frames. I took, I wanted to get all the waves and I wanted to get a lot of sky. So I took one photo and then shifted the camera up and then took one of the sky and just stitched them together. There you go, big square. So this is the photograph I took the next morning, and at first I had in mind that same sort of photograph I took the night before, and I realised pretty soon that I wasn't going to get that sort of light In fact, photographically speaking, this is not really great light at all. It's a pretty clear sky with just a bit of pink there. But I think it was the composition that I found that made it special. In that, what I like to do with any composition is how it flows. So what you see here is your eye sort of goes out here, down, up, like that. That's how it's supposed to go. And then there was a swirl, which sort of added something extra to it. I took about 20 to 30 frames, and this was the only one where I could get the swirl in. It's funny about the Joe Cornish connection. There was his book, Tunnel Rock, and then that Joe Cornish would be the judge who wrote the comment in the yearbook and on the website about this photo. When I get a lot of questions about gear and when I should, am I going to upgrade this or that? The fact is that when I went to London and saw the print at 1 meter, I looked at it and said, well, colours are good. It is completely sharp from front to back. I don't need new gear. The gear that I already have, I'm completely happy with. It does everything I need it to do. Just using that same sort of technique, you can get swirls. This is the same beach. In fact, it was photographed the same day as dawn stars, just showing you, the really cool rock formations on that beach. Compositionally, I'm not all that happy with this one, but there's a rainbow, and I feel a lot of the time it's hard to get a really good rainbow photograph because you tend to, it seems to be something you want to document, and it's hard to really come up with a compelling composition. This beach is really limitless with the amount of compositions that you can come up with. Now, this one I was with a group of photographers, and once again the weather was very poor, and we were sitting in the car just waiting it out, and I was having a nap, and I said, okay, if anything happens, just give me wake me up. Well, I woke up myself, and I looked over the shoulder of my friend there. I said, is that something on the windscreen, or is that a hole in the sky? And I said, well, it's a hole in the sky, so everyone, car doors slamming, running down, and the weather was still pretty dire, but made for some dramatic conditions, and it just sort of reiterates to me that you never give up. You never know what's going to happen. This one's made it to the finals of the Anzac competition this year. I think competition's a little bit of a controversial issue because a lot of people will say, what's the value of a competition? Art's subjective. Is it compatible with being judged? What does it mean to be a winner? To be a chosen one? Well, it just means that, a bunch of people thought on that day that, these photos stuck. It won't tell you how you measure up to others, but it is good to be recognised, especially repeatedly, just to know that there's, you've got some consistency, and that your peers like your work. What does it mean to be in the Veolia exhibition? Well, there's exposure, but to me the biggest thing is actually being there, able to meet the other contestants, and ask, just talk to them. The stories you hear are an inspiration every year, and it's really a big kick in the behind for me. I just feel so lazy after talking to these guys. Many are National Geographic photographers, and they spend months getting their shots. So this is further up on the west coast, Cape Foul Wind. Not a great name, but pretty nice place. This is one of the reasons why I think that seascapes are particularly accessible. In that, if you have no foreground to work with, you can always use the water. And I've taken an abstract photo of that wave that you see, actually. This is another outstanding New Zealand location, Kaikoura, in Canterbury, north of Christchurch. A really impressive setting. Once again, you have coastline, mountains, and you also have a very diverse marine life, including sperm whales, dolphins, seals, albatrosses, and all sorts of birds. I use a lot of wide-angle lenses, and the problem with using wide-angle lenses a lot of the time is that when you have foreground elements, midground elements, and background elements, like here, the mountains, they seem quite diminished in scale. So one way to get around that is just to take out my telephoto. And I like taking photographs of animals in their environment. It's really exciting to photograph with that extra variable. You don't know what the animal's going to do. Here I've used a telephoto and it's kept the scale, so the mountains actually look like mountains. And then straight after that, I pointed the camera down and got something different. Another location in New Zealand with oceans and mountains. Here are some storms over the Southern Alps at Jackson Bay in Haast, which is a place I really should go back and explore some more. And finally, this is Moeraki Beach in Golden Bay, and I recently wrote a little blog article that sometimes words and photos fail to deliver. And although I really like the beach in Paparoa, I think it's the best for photography. This is the most amazing location I've ever been to. It's just the feeling of remoteness, being at the edge of the world, windswept. There is no photo that I've seen that comes close to capturing what it is like to stand on this beach. I actually took this. You can see a sea cave on the right side there. That's how I actually, the tide was up and I actually accessed this part of the beach through it at the time. And this is, once again, part of the Moeraki Beach. It just shows that, there's sometimes I just feel like sighing and putting the camera away. The experience is so much more overwhelming than the photos that you can come away with. Oh, so that's the last slide, and I'm very happy in that this is the first time I've done a presentation using my iPad. It hasn't run out of battery. It's got this high retina display that eats up batteries very quickly.